Okay, so I hope everyone's going well, and I hope that you managed to survive the last couple of weeks okay without the course. I just want to check that it's okay if I put gallery view on, right? You're not recording my screen.
Excuse me, Bhante, go ahead.
It's okay if I put gallery view on, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
I want to see people. I don't want to see my own face there.
That's fine. That's
Yeah,
fine.
that then creates Zoom dysmorphia.
Sure.
Too much staring at your own face all day. Okay, very good. So yes, great to see everybody back. And nice to see that by tackling such a somewhat difficult and dry topic that we haven't managed to scare everybody off yet. So I'm hoping we manage to chase a few of you away today. We'll see how many people stay to the end anyway. Okay, so in the last couple of courses, we have begun with our reading of Jayatilleka's early Buddhist theory of knowledge. Each one of these sessions, I'm recommending a couple of chapters from the book, and I will be discussing some portions of those chapters. Because this is only a short course, we can't hope to do everything in detail, but I do hope to do enough to be able to indicate to you something of what the contents of this book are, how it works and why it matters, and how that relates to what the Buddha taught. And I also hope that in doing so, we can give ourselves some, I don't know, I think give ourselves maybe some confidence and some methodology to be able to use these ideas and these methods a little bit more carefully and with a little bit more competence than we were able to do in the past. For today, I just want to begin by acknowledging that we give the course on the land of the Baramadical people of the Darug Nation, or at least I am. I'm sure all of you are in different places, and those of you who are in Australia will be seated on the land of various Indigenous peoples. I also wanted to acknowledge that today is the anniversary of the 9/11 tragedy in New York, and to express my thoughts of sympathy and compassion for the 3,000 people who died on that day and all of their family members and the loss that came from that. And also for the 1 million people who died in the wars that were launched following those attacks and which are just coming to an end now. All right. We are going to be moving on to chapters 6 and 7 of Jayatilleka's book, covering the topics of analysis and meaning, and also the topics of logic and truth. That's a lot, all right? And so again, we're just dipping into it, and hopefully we'll come up with some interesting things. Now, before the course, however, Mitchell pointed out that there are a couple of interesting things in the previous chapter which we didn't get round to touching on, and I would like to begin just by briefly mentioning those details. And so this begins with, where are we now? Paragraph 436 in the chapter on the attitude to reason. And there are just some good points in these paragraphs. So I'll just make these good points briefly. Okay, paragraph 436, it said that one of the 4 types of religions which are said to be unsatisfactory, but not necessarily false. All right, so this is an interesting description, right? So a religion or a spiritual path might not be wrong, but it can also be unsatisfactory. This is a distinction that we're going to be returning to. Herein, a certain teacher is a reasoner investigator. He teaches a doctrine which is self-evident and is a product of reasoning and pursuit of speculation. But in the case of a person who reasons and speculates, his reasoning may be good or bad, true or false. The same problem here that we met in the passage referring to the Anusavika, that is the one who relies on oral tradition. So we then have different possibilities. Something may be well-reasoned and true. It may be well-reasoned and false. It may be ill-reasoned, but still true. And it may be ill-reasoned and false. And so I think it's really important to bear these different possibilities in mind, because it's very easy to fall into the trap of seeing things simplistically and assuming that if something is well-reasoned, therefore it must be true, or something is ill-reasoned, therefore it must be false. And because of that tendency that we fall into, people who want to spread false doctrines and harmful doctrines will brush up their reason in order to convince people. This is a deliberate strategy which has been pursued over many years by many people who are pushing these kinds of things. An obvious example, which I sort of grew up with and which became apparent in my early years in Buddhism and indeed beforehand, was among certain kinds of Christian missionaries who will study Buddha's teachings with an effort to refute them. So they will have like lists of arguments to refute Buddhism. So when they come to knock on your door to try to persuade you to give up Buddhism, they've already got all the arguments worked out. And so this is the kind of attitude of somebody who is not actually interested in using reason to find the truth. They're interested in using reason in order to push their point of view. And so sometimes when they do that, their arguments might in fact be good, right? There might be a point to them. But because of the way that they're pushing a predetermined outcome, the whole project becomes suspect. And we can see that same thing has really taken off a lot online, and we find that same kind of disingenuous argumentation being used a lot by people sort of engaging in bad faith arguments on the internet. So good to be aware of that. Okay. The next ground for accepting a proposition is said to be unsatisfactory is naya hetu. So naya hetu, without going into the whole discussion there, essentially means something like inference. So you can draw something out by an inference. Inference is never 100%. Inference is always a probabilistic kind of knowing. The next ground on which one becomes said to be should not accept propositions of true is atara parivitaka, which is means to accept something on the basis of reflection on the reasons. And in paragraph 439 here, Jayatileka goes on to the passages that support that reading, particularly where it talks about having the akaravati sadha dasana mulika. This is one of the important discourses in the Majjhima Nikaya, where it talks about the akaravati sadha is a reasoned faith, or perhaps a belief supported by reasons. Dasana mulika, grounded in vision or in seeing. So this proposition is pointing to the fact that in order to prove something, we can go and we can look for what the evidence is for that thing. What are the grounds for holding that belief? And once again, these things can turn out well or they can turn out poorly, because obviously we can shift the grounds to whatever we want. And this is where we can start using statistics and so-called evidence by cherry-picking things and pointing to the things that we like in order to get the conclusion that we wanted. And so this is why reflection on reasons also is important, but by itself does not guarantee truth. Okay, so skepticism is, this is why skepticism is always important in these things. Not necessarily skepticism, but certainly caution. And it's one of those things which, from the perspective of somebody who has some expertise in the field, they will always kind of know these things. You know, they will always know, like, in what way data is being cherry picked in order to arrive at a certain conclusion. A classic example of that sort of misuse of the akara parivitaka in the Australian government's positions on climate change. They will often quote that our carbon footprint carbon dioxide emissions has decreased by such and such since 2003. And that looks good. Oh, we've decreased this much since 2003. That's great. But then you go and look, well, 2003, I think it's 2003, it was around then, was the peak year of carbon emissions. So they're comparing it to the peak. And the majority of the drop in emissions since then was under the previous Labor administration, when the emissions fell rapidly because of the carbon tax. So then they're saying, well, we're doing okay because the emissions have fallen. So this is a classic example of cherry picking. And somebody who's an expert in the field would look at that immediately and understand, well, this is just a distortion of the facts. And yet it's not actually lying per se. So this is the akara parivitaka and how it can be used and misused. All right, next one. Kanti. This one is really important. This is the acceptance of a view after reflecting. And what this is pointing to is the agreeability of an idea because it conforms with one's own preconceptions. And this is a huge like filter, like a knowing filter that is applied to essentially everything that we do. I mean, how the mechanism works is that views are hard. Having an opinion about things is hard. It takes work. You have to think about it. You have to reflect about it. You have to form it. You have to evolve it. You have to question it. And you have to gradually build it up over many years. And it takes us in our life decades to evolve the views that we have. And because views are hard, we don't like to change them. I mean, we like to think that we like to change them. We like to imagine that we'd like to change them, but we rarely, in fact, do. We might modify them in small ways, but our big views, we change rarely. There's a big infrastructure in them. Think of it like, say, a city. You know, you've got a city and the infrastructure is built for, let's say, suburbs and cars, like Sydney is largely built for. And we might say, oh, we think high density housing is really good because it helps us to reduce our carbon emissions. That's great. But it's not so easy to change it, is it? Yeah, I mean, we can do it as a long-term plan to encourage more high density housing, but it's very difficult to just say, let's stop doing one thing and do another thing. And so our minds are very much the same. Our minds are not nearly as flexible as we imagine. We receive views according to what is pleasing to us, what is kanti, what is acceptable, what is going to challenge us the least. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, you can't go in your life just throwing out all of your knowledge all the time, right? It just doesn't work like that. You have to rely on the things that you've learned in your life. And yet at the same time, if our only knowledge is the things that is acceptable to us, then we will never really challenge ourselves and we will never really change our views and our values. So this is nijjhana kanti. And this is why I think this idea of nijjhana is introduced here, because nijjhana is like a pondering. It's like it goes to sort of it's like a deeper level transformation of our views. And so we can accept a position after this deep level pondering, but even that may be right or it may be wrong. Yeah. All right, so this is just some short reflections on the ideas of some of these ideas of the ways that we can learn things, which may turn out one way or the other, just as faith and oral tradition and so on may turn out one way or the other. And again, the point with all of these kinds of things is not that they're wrong, but that they can't in and of themselves be relied on as an absolute source of truth. Not easy, is it? Right? It's not easy. If you're coming along and expecting a simple answer, how do you know things, then you're not going to get one. And if you did get one, it might seem nice, but it's probably not going to work out, because truth is slippery. That's just the reality of it all. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 6 on analysis of meaning, and we're looking at we're going to look at two different. These are really two different topics here. I'm going to focus more on the topic of meaning than the topic of analysis. In all of these, what we're doing is we're looking at the ways in which the Buddha responded to the kinds of truth-seeking means that were available in his time and his culture, where he rejected some, accepted others, modified others, and applied them in the search for the truth that mattered to him. Now, remember right from the beginning that everything the Buddha taught is about the Four Noble Truths. So this has to be our fundamental assumption. The truth that we're looking for has something to do with the Four Noble Truths. In other words, it has something to do with suffering. So right from the beginning, the Buddha is restricting the scope of what he was talking about. This is important. It's important to restrict the scope. Again, we saw from the beginning, we discussed briefly about how in the 20th century, there had been a number of different philosophers and thinkers who had come to accept this idea that we have to accept the limits of knowledge. And it is that acceptance of the limits of knowledge that make knowledge possible. So the Buddha kept the scope of his knowledge within what mattered for him and for his project, the ending of suffering. And sometimes people would be criticize him. They say, oh, we wanted to learn about all of these other things, but all the Buddha does is teach about the ending of suffering. And the Buddha said, thinking to criticize me, they actually praise me. All right, let's just have a look at chapter 6 quite briefly. Paragraph 443 in this chapter. So I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat here. Okay, so please do pop some questions in the chat. And thanks to everyone who's said that. Venerable Adi Sila said hello. How are you going, Venerable? Hope your Vasa is going well. Okay, 443. In this chapter, we propose to examine the nature of the analytical outlook, which is one of the features of the thought of the Pali Canon. It is to this outlook that we have to trace the tendency towards classification, definition, and the delimitation of the meaning of terms, which becomes very marked in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Earlier in the Nikayas, the analytical approach combined with an empiricism results in certain important insights and observations with regard to the meaning of propositions. Okay, so this is the topic of this chapter. Now, I said before, I'm going to mostly skip over the portions dealing with analysis, the reason being that they are quite long and probably too much. But just to reiterate the point that Jayatileka is making there, the Buddha was a highly analytical thinker. By analysis, what it means is that he would chop things up into bits and he would see how those bits fit into each other. And that the word we translate as analysis is vibhanga, which literally means to slice into bits or to break up into bits. And so this is kind of of course, a very important approach to solving problems, right? So if our problem is like all of this, everything's suffering, then that's overwhelming. How do you deal with that? Well, you deal with that by breaking a huge problem into little bits, and you address each one by one. One of those little bits is to say, well, say, okay, everything kind of life is suffering. How do I deal with everything in life is suffering? Well, let's start with, say, my body is suffering because my body gets old. Okay, that's already a lot, but that's somewhere we can focus and look into one aspect of it. We can restrict the scope of the problem. So this is really the purpose of the analytical method, is to help us to clarify our understanding by breaking big problems into little problems. All right. And as Jayatilleka said, this method is used extensively in the suttas, but then it becomes highly developed in the Abhidhamma. And many, especially of the Theravadan Abhidhamma books, are solely concerned with this question of analysis and compatibility. Which things fit inside other things? Which things, where do things go? How do they relate to each other? And several books like the Patana, the Yamaka, and others, that's basically all they do. In this, the Theravadan Abhidhamma is quite unusual. The analytical method is not used to the same extent in the Abhidhammas of the northern schools, which tend to be more discursive, more narrative, more based on a kind of a discussion of issues rather than purely a kind of mechanical analytical approach. But like I said, I'm not going to discuss that analytical approach in too much detail. Let us just continue with a few more paragraphs at the beginning of this chapter. The cautious, critical, and analytical approach towards the study of the nature of things is undoubtedly an inheritance of Buddhism from the mood of the age in which it takes its rise. Important point there. The materialists had discarded all that was hitherto taken on faith or trust in the most hallowed of traditions and contrasted baseless belief with the knowledge of what can be directly perceived and proved on the basis of perception. The skeptics went a step further and denied the possibility of knowledge altogether in the face of a medley of conflicting theories, and probably doubted the evidence of the senses as well. All this could not but have an impact on the elite of the age, the Vinyu Purisa, commonly mentioned throughout the suttas, an intelligent person, a person who knows what's going on. Such as Payasi, the famous skeptic, who tried to salvage what he could of the old beliefs with new methodology and critical outlook, though with negative results. Since Buddhism tried to appeal to this intelligentsia, it could not afford to establish itself by dogmatic appeals, but had to rely on rational persuasion based on a critical outlook. The appeal to reason seems to have been quite common at this time, judging by the fact that both the orthodox as well as their opponents resorted to it. The orthodox, of course, referring to the Brahmins and Brahmanical schools. The Buddhist and Jain works, as we've seen, mention many metaphysical theories belonging to diverse schools of thought, heterodox and orthodox, which were rationally constructed, if not rationally defended against each other. The Maitreya Upanishad reinforces and confirms what we learn from the heterodox literature. It stresses the importance of basing our claims to knowledge on valid means of knowledge. Maitreya Upanishad being one of the early Upanishads, probably a little later than the time of the Buddha. It stresses the importance of basing our claims to knowledge on valid means of knowledge. At the same time, it presents a picture of the atmosphere of confusion and controversy, which was a product of the rational temper of the age. It mentions the hindrances to knowledge present at the time when there were those who loved to distract the believers in the Veda by the jugglery of false arguments, comparisons, and paralogisms. It warns the Vedic students not to associate with them and laments this world disturbed by false reasoning. In the face of a critical audience, those who wished to propagate their doctrines had to be critical themselves. It was not surprising, therefore, that the leader of the Jains recommended the importance of analysis, or vibhajya vada, in the exposition of doctrines. And the Buddha himself claims to be an analyst and not a dogmatist who makes categorical assertions. So both the Jains and the Buddhists claim to be propounding what they call the vibhajya vada. Now, this is an interesting term. The vibhajya vada is an interesting term, which comes back is current in Buddhism today. And so we'll just discuss that briefly. But again, just to reflect first on the point that Jayatilleka is making there is that Buddhism from the beginning was responding to and participating in the manner of dialogue which was current in their society, of which the Buddha was only one voice. So the Buddha was not involved in making dogmatic assertions about his teaching and assuming that people are going to believe him because of who he is, but he was engaging in a critical discussion where he would quite literally go out of his way to talk to people about their beliefs, listen to what they had to say, and respond to their ideas. And there are countless examples of this happening right throughout the suttas. This is really important for us to understand, and it's really important for us to realize as people who are living in an age where I'm sure many of you can recognize all of the things that Jayatilleka is describing there. And our own age has much of that same kind of spirit. And this is one of the things which I think has been led to the success or the international success of Buddhism, is that we do share that spirit of inquiry and seeking for knowledge. And I think this is a really kind of wonderful thing. And I find it really liberating and really exciting. And I think that Buddhism should not prevail because of our faith in the Buddha. Buddhism should prevail because it makes genuine contributions to our understanding. And one of our tasks is to see where the Buddha's teachings can actually do that. Are we able to make genuine contributions? And I think that so far we have not even begun to touch the potential of the Buddha's teachings in terms of our impact in the wider society. The only real area where Buddhism has had a major impact is in psychology, where Buddhist psychology has indeed transformed the practice and the theory of psychology in the last couple of decades. But and that's of course due to the efforts of John Kabat-Zinn and others teaching the mindfulness studies. But there are so many other areas where that same thing could be happening, whether it's in philosophy, whether it's in problems of artificial intelligence, ethical problems in the nature of speech, logic, and other things. And so I think that there are so many areas where we can be taking the spirit that the Buddha taught, where he was not trying to browbeat people into believing what he said, but trying to engage with them and persuade them and show that there is a better way of seeing these things. All right, let's return to the topic of Vibhajyavada. Now, the basic word Vibhajyavada is simple enough. Vibhajya means to analyze or literally to separate into parts. Vada is a speech, but is used in the sense of a doctrine. So Vibhajyavada is a doctrine of analysis, or one who is a proponent of the doctrine of analysis. And it's opposed to somebody who makes one-sided or dogmatic statements. Okay, so Jayatilleka goes on to continue this approach. What is meant by this, in paragraph 447, what is meant by this claim, the claim to be a Vibhajyavadan, is clear from the context. The Buddha is asked for his opinion as to the truth of two propositions. The householder succeeds in attaining what is right, just, and good, and the monk does not succeed in attaining what is right, just, and good. The Buddha says that one cannot make a categorical assertion as to the truth or falsity of propositions of this sort, categorical assertion being ekangsa vada. In the case of the first of the above propositions, if the subject had the characteristic miccha patipanna of bad conduct, then the proposition is false. But if the subject had the opposite characteristic of right, good conduct, then the proposition would be true. It's implied that there are certain propositions of which it is not possible to say whether they are true or false without clearing up ambiguities and making certain qualifications. and the Buddha is an analyst insofar as he analyzes such propositions and makes the requisite qualifications without asserting that they are categorically true or false. So this is the basic idea of the Vibhajyavada. And it's worth noting that through time and through history, the Vibhajyavada has come to have a number of different senses. The Vibhajyavada, here the Buddha is talking about the Vibhajyavada as being a sort of a characteristic of the approach that he uses when teaching. After the time of the Buddha, perhaps 200 or 300 years, it seems that some of the schools of Buddhism began referring to themselves as Vibhajyavada. And so we have this kind of occurrence of a historical Vibhajyavada as one of the Buddhist schools, or perhaps as certain of the Buddhist schools. The Theravadins refer to themselves quite frequently as Vibhajyavada. It's not entirely clear always whether they meant that this is like a school called Vibhajyavada, or which is a school which follows the idea of taking an analytical approach to teachings. Sometimes historically, it's the idea of Vibhajyavada seems to have been used in a more specific sense, as in contrast with the Sarvastivada. Sarvastivada was one of the major movements of schools in Buddhism in ancient India, and their primary doctrine was that all dhammas, past, present, and future, exist. Okay? All things, past, present, and future, exist. Sarvang asti. Now, that's a kind of an odd thing to say, right? Now, philosophically, it's interesting. It seems to contradict the idea of impermanence, as well as common sense, but the Sarvastivadins were no fools. There was a highly sophisticated philosophy. And so they had very, cogent defenses and discussions of their main thing. But sometimes it seems that Vibhajyavada was used in distinction to the Sarvastivada, so that those schools who made a distinction between past, present, and future were called Vibhajyavada. So in that sense, the Theravadins would have been one of the Vibhajyavadan school, although by no means the only one. In the modern day, Vibhajyavada also has been co-opted as the name of a movement in Sri Lanka. So there's a whole kind of movement in Sri Lanka who refer to themselves as Vibhajyavadins. So I don't know that much about them. We've had some kind of dealings with them, but they seem to be folks who adhere quite strongly to the traditional Theravadan texts and commentaries. It seems to be their defining feature, as far as I can tell. So this is the Vibhajyavada, and this is what the Buddha meant when he was Vibhajyavada. So he would analyze things before answering. Now, Jayatilleka continues by discussing the Jains, and the Jains had a similar kind of idea called the Anekantavada, which is interesting in the relationship between the Anekantavada, which is not making categorical statements, and that relation between that and Buddhism is quite interesting. But I will skip over that and head to paragraph 452. And in paragraph 452, we have the series of 4 kinds of questions which the Buddha teaches in the Anguttara Nikaya. Now, again, some context is probably useful. The Anguttara Nikaya, of all of the Nikayas, is the one which has the most concern with details of how to teach the Dhamma, how to convey it, how to engage in a conversation about the Dhamma. And so for that reason, it has a lot of very interesting and practical information about these things. And one of the most useful of those is this set of 4 kinds of questions. So from Jayatilleka's translations here, Ekanksa Vyakaraniyo, a question which ought to be answered, explained categorically. Patipuchha Vyakaraniyo, a question that ought to be replied with a counter question. Banha Tapaniyo, a question that should be set aside. Vibhajya vyakaraniya, a question which ought to be explained analytically. All right. So this gives us an entry point into looking at how the Buddha answered different kinds of questions, and to start to ask why he would approach different people in different ways, why he would reply in one way to one person, a different way in a different person, what's going on there. And that's really helpful for us in engaging with conversations, or not, as the case may be. And I'm going to actually focus on that not case, because that's very quieting in many instances. But just briefly go over each one of these, the questions which should be answered categorically. This is the easy one, right? So did the Buddha teach about suffering? Yes. Yeah. Can I find happiness purely through indulging in everything that I want? No. So these are nice, easy questions. So this is the ones which to be explained categorically. The Patipucca ones to be explained in terms of a counter question. For example, when I meditate, can I realize my higher self? All right. When I meditate, can I realize my higher self? Well, that requires a counter question. What do you mean by higher self? Oh, what I mean by higher self is that I'll have more compassion and love. Okay, yes. Yeah. What I mean by my higher self is I will realize the permanent and eternal Atman, which will exist forever. Yeah. In that case, no. Right? So this is a kind of question which requires a counter question, so it requires clarification. And the one that requires analysis also, a question that needs to be broken down into different parts before we can reply to it. Now, Jayatilleka goes into quite a bit of detail into all of these. It takes us far too long to go on those, but I will skip most of those and focus on the questions to be set aside. This is perhaps one of the most interesting and enigmatic of these categories. Why is it appropriate to sometimes not answer something? And this is like a really useful one on social media. And, you don't have to stay on your computer all night because somebody is wrong on the internet. It's okay to simply not say anything and to not have the last word. What are under what circumstances do we do that? I mean, I have to say, just for myself, the single most useful thing to know when there's no point in continuing the conversation is when somebody can't admit that they're wrong. Yeah, I mean, we all make mistakes. It's a normal part of life, and that's okay. And if someone makes a mistake and you say, well, actually, that's not true, and then they just continue on without acknowledging that, then you're like, well, it's not possible to have a reasonable discussion with this person. So I'll just not. So this is the simplest red flag in many cases. But let's have a look at what the Buddha talked about when he talked about the tapaniya banha. And we're going to skip forward to paragraph number 469. All right, the next, and I'll read a few paragraphs of Jayatilleka here. The next kind of question answered, the tapaniya, is interesting insofar as it seems to have a modern parallel in the kind of question which the positivist dismisses as meaningless and therefore unanswerable. And if you recall from our first class, by positivist here, he means those who belong to the logical positivist school of Western philosophy, a school which he was associated with. I wouldn't say where he belonged to it, but at least was one of the prominent schools in his time. And positivists were kind of like a fairly kind of aggressively secularist and rationalist school, and they believed that that traditional metaphysical questions often were meaningless and should not be even bothered discussing. So questions like, say, what is the meaning of life, or is there such a thing as a God, or something like that. And a lot of the questions that philosophy had traditionally had concerned itself with were dismissed by the positivists as unanswerable. I mean, this is it's a very kind of narrow take on the truth. I mean, a lot of the time when people don't engage with religious and metaphysical ideas because of their truth value, but because of their emotional value. They don't go to church because they think that it's objectively true, but because it provides them with solace. And I'm not sure that the positivists were interested in that. Anyway, okay, fine. So there's kinds of questions which should be set aside. Various sources, including the Milinda Bandha, the late book in the Pali Canon, the commentary to the Anguttara Nikaya, the Mahasangikas, which you'll recall is the earliest group that split apart from the Theravadan group. So the Mahasangikas are usually the group that has least shared ideas with what we know of from the Theravada, which implies that where we do have something in common, that it quite possibly stems from a very early time. So Mahasangikas and the Abhidhammikas all agree in giving the Avyakarana, the unanswered questions, in question form as examples of this kind of question, and so on. Let me just skip aside the question 471. The question is why these questions were set aside. Buddhaghosa defines, the author or editor of the Pali commentaries, defines Tapaniya Bandha as a question which ought not to be explained and which ought to be set aside on the ground that it was not explained by the Exalted One. This is not very helpful, for he's virtually saying that these questions ought to be set aside because they've been set aside by the Buddha. But the problem is, why did the Buddha set them aside? Did these questions have a certain property which made them unanswerable? Or were they in principle unanswerable categorically or analytically, though set aside for a special reason? If the latter was the case, the questions do not belong to a logically different type, whereas if the former is the case, they would fall into a class of their own. It is also possible that the questions which were classified as tapaniya to be set aside were a mixed lot, of which some were said in the former and some in the latter. We have discussed in a later chapter what consideration led us to conclude that these questions to be set aside on pragmatic grounds, since belief in any of the four possible answers was considered irrelevant. It is possible to argue that these questions were regarded to be in principle answerable, categorically though dismissed for pragmatic reasons. But it's necessary to note that nowhere is it directly stated that these beliefs were either categorically true or categorically false. They were only pacceka saccas, individual or partial truths, and a product of wrong reflection. When we consider all the evidence, it's clear that at least some of these questions were considered to have such a logical nature that no answer or no categorical answer could be given to them. All right, so just introducing this concept here of the pacceka sacca. And this is a concept that we find a number of times in the suttas. You're probably familiar with the idea of the pacceka Buddha as the Buddha who becomes enlightened for themselves and doesn't form a teaching community. The pacceka sacca, so pacceka has the sense of like individual or for oneself. So pacceka sacca is one's own truth. Also, this is also a really kind of interesting idea because this is something which is so common today, isn't it? We have the idea, oh, this is my truth. You might have your truth, right? This is how I see it. That's how you see it. And often this can be a very reductive way of looking at it, because once you have individual truths, you can't have a rational discussion. All you can do is have people telling their opinions at each other. That's it. And the whole purpose of having a rational discussion, so you can have a community of people who have a shared understanding, falls by the wayside. And this idea of falling back to individual truths is, I think, like deeply nihilistic and deeply undermining of the possibility of community and of the very meaning of what we're doing. Like consider in a consider if you're doing some kind of practical job, okay, a simple practical job. You have to put up a shed in the backyard. All right. Most of us have probably put up a shed once or twice, and you have a couple of people who are putting up the shed. Okay, now the shed is going to be 1 meter on one side and 1.5 meters on the other side. That's great. Well, to you it is. I appreciate the fact that for you this shed is 2 by 1.5 meters. You know, but for me, that's not big enough. So my shed is going to be 2.4 meters by 1.6 meters. So, you know, I'm quite happy to accept the fact that you have your truth. So, you know, you cut your woods, your length, and I'll cut my woods, my length. And, you know, then we'll both be happy because we'll both have our individual sides of the shed, which are of different lengths. Now, I don't know about you, but that's probably going to be an awkward shed. And generally speaking, you want to agree on the basic facts of the reality of the situation. And if you're actually dealing with anything that's real, you need to come to some kind of consensus. Now, you don't need to agree about everything, of course. Right? You can put up a shed and you can say, well, I think there should be 3 shelves. And someone says, I think there should be 2 shelves. And at the end of the day, well, you pick one or the other. You don't actually have to necessarily agree. But there has to be some kind of way of finding a consensus. And when people fall on this idea of individual truths, when it comes to spiritual life and meaning, what they're essentially saying is that these are purely ideas that have no consequences. That we can have these different ideas because they don't matter. You can believe this, you can believe that, but none of these beliefs have any relation to reality. None of these beliefs affect the real world. None of these beliefs have any consequences at all. So we can just hold these things consequent free and we'll have these different ideas. That's what's required. But that's not how Buddhism sees things, because for Buddhism, these things do have consequences. They are meaningful, and we are participating in some way in a shared reality. And there are things in this reality that are true and things that are false. And as we've seen, of course, the Buddha's talking about the limits to that. The Buddha's not trying to say we can define everything and define the truth and the falsity of everything, but we can talk about some things and we can have some kind of shared reality. And so the fallback on the pacceka sacca is a kind of intellectual laziness. It's an inability to grapple with the limitations and falsities of one's own ideas and the inability to develop a relationship of trust and civility and rationality with others that would allow us to be able to have a meaningful conversation. That's what happens when we fall back on our individual truths. So the Buddha was very dismissive of this idea of the pacceka sacca. And I think we have to be really, really careful about this. Now, obviously, again, that's not to say that there are some things where it's okay. I mean, obviously there are plenty of areas where, you know, people can have different opinions, but there are limits. There are limits. Okay, let us continue. Pacceka saccas, where are we going? Blah, blah, blah. 4, 6, 9. Okay, 4, 6, 9. Okay, tapaniya. Okay. 474. Four of the unanswered questions concern the existence of the Tathagata after death. If a categorical answer to the question as to whether the Tathagata exists or is reborn after death was possible, it should be possible to say, according to the laws of logic, that one of the 4 alternatives must be true. Now, we observe that the Buddha takes the 4 logically possible answers and shows that none of them fit the case, upeti. None of them adequately describe that condition, that situation. So you can't say that he's born, that he's not born, that he is and he's not born, and you can't say that he's neither is nor is not born. So these 4-fold options we call the tetralemma, although Jayatilleka doesn't like that name, but anyway, I'll use it because it's convenient. We'll call the tetralemma, and we're going to be discussing that in more detail a little bit later. So in the case of whether the Buddha is reborn, then there's no categorical answer to that question that fits in with any of those four things. Vacha, paragraph 475, Vacha, the interlocutor in the above context, is confounded by this reply of the Buddha, apparently because he thought of one of the four logical alternatives must be true, and says that he has lost whatever faith he derived from the earlier part of the discourse. The Buddha then reassures Vacha, saying that there is no cause here for a lack of discernment or confusion, and goes on to illustrate with a simile while none of the possible answers fit the case. Here, since this simile is important, we shall reproduce it here. The Buddha says, if this fire in front of you were to go out, would you know this fire in front of me has gone out? Vacha says, if it was, I would know. The Buddha says, now if somebody were to ask you, this fire in front of you, which has gone out, in which direction has it gone? East, west, north, or south? Question thus, how would you reply? Vacha, I would say it does not fit the case. It does not apply, na upeti. The fire, which blazed on account of the fuel and grass and sticks, came to be reckoned as gone out, since it has consumed the fuel and was not fed with more fuel. So this simile clearly illustrates that the question, in which direction has the fire gone, is one to which no categorical reply by means of any of the four logical alternatives is possible by the very nature of the question. No categorical reply would aptly describe the situation. The question is grammatically correct in its form and appears to have meaning owing to the logic of go out. This verb is used with person words, and it makes sense in such usages to ask in what direction has such a person gone out. A categorical and meaningful answer specifying the direction is possible in this question. Now, our symbolism or linguistic usage permits us to extend the use of go out for such processes as fires or lights. But in such situations, we would be committing a category mistake if we assume that the going out takes place in a specific direction. And in invoking the term category mistake, he's invoking the philosopher Gilbert Ryle, who theorized about this idea of a category mistake, and particularly in the context of the theory of the mind. And in fact, when I studied philosophy of the mind, Gilbert Ryle's book was the first one that we read. If we specific direction, so category mistake is where you ask a question which logically and grammatically seems pertinent, but it's actually just thinking about things in entirely the wrong way, putting things in the wrong kind of category. A lot of category mistakes come from the misapprehension of the use of metaphors in language. Often in that kind of context, the sort of poetical phrase by E. Cummings, green dreams sleep furiously, is evoked. Green dreams sleep furiously. Anyway, all right. It therefore makes no sense to ask in which direction has the fire gone, for if we were making a category mistake and therefore asking a nonsensical question to which no meaningful answer is possible. In fact, Wittgenstein gives the same example to illustrate this kind of question, which our symbolism apparently permits, though it is based on a confusion of the logic of concepts. Thus it can come about, and quoting from Wittgenstein here, thus it can come about that we aren't able to rid ourselves of the implications of our symbolism, which seems to have admit of a question like where does a flame of candle go out when it's blown out? So where does the light go out? We have become obsessed with our symbolism. We may say that we are led on into puzzlement by an analogy which irresistibly drags us on. Okay, that's again a really insightful question and pointing to very much the same thing that the Buddha was pointing to here. We become trapped in our language, and we forget that our language is merely a set of symbols and metaphors that is supposed to approximate to the world in some way. And yet, because the language is formed in certain ways, there are certain things that in the language itself that imply something's meaningful. But the context, in the context, that is not necessarily the case. So this is a very subtle kind of rhetorical sleight of hand. And again, it's a means that people engaging, especially in arguments that are either bad faith or in arguments that are determined by some pre-existing logical imperative, will engage in. Just by the way, for me, the concepts of bad faith and good faith in argumentation are very important. These are ideas which I've drawn from Sartre. And bad faith is the idea that it essentially means something like insincerity. So if you're engaging in something with bad faith, that means that you're creating the appearance of engaging in something, but the reality is hidden to either to the other or to yourself. And a typical kind of bad faith argument is when somebody says, I had no choice. And Sartre would say that you always have a choice. Even if your only choices are bad choices, you always got some kind of choice. So as soon as you say you've got no choice, then you're lying to yourself, possibly, probably, or else lying to other people as well. You might not have any good choices. You might not have any acceptable choices, but you always got some kind of choice. Anyway, so Jayatilleka continues. It is therefore clear that the author of this sutta considered this question as a meaningless one and as falling into a type of question which were by their very nature unanswerable and have therefore to be set aside. This question is given as an example to illustrate the nature of the question, vimutta citto kuhing upapajjati, where does one whose mind has been freed be reborn? Which is said also to be one to which no categorical reply is possible. And since this is in effect intended to be intent the same question, as in where does the Tathagata exist after death, we may presume that at least these questions were considered to be set aside in the sense that they ought to be set aside as unanswerable. Owing to the very form of the question is put, is strictly meaningless and no meaningful answer in any of the logical alternatives were possible. So certainly we can agree that Jayatilleka likes to write very long sentences with multiple subsidiary clauses and to leave his Pali quotes untranslated, none of which helps us particularly to determine the limits and meaning of his symbolic structures. But anyway, hopefully by now this is clear enough. Now let me just see. Let's skip over to 479. There are a number of questions regarded as inappropriate questions which are set aside in the Nikayas on the ground that they are literally meaningless. Thus, the question, what is decay and death, and of whom is this decay and death, is said to be a misleading question, nakalo banho, to ask. This question is given if one were to say, what is decay and death, and of who is this decay of death, or if one were to say that decay and death is one thing, and this decay and death belong to another thing. Both these questions are the same in meaning, only the wording is different. The question is supposed to assume and imply that the subject of the attributes is ontologically different from the attributes themselves and is thus considered to give a misleading picture of the facts. In the context I mentioned the two unanswered questions, the soul is the same as the body, or the body is different, or the body and the soul are two different things. Such questions, which are suggested by the grammar of the language, which give or imply a false or distorted picture of the nature of reality, were considered inappropriate and were presumably set aside. A long list of such inappropriate questions of the same model or logical structure are mentioned. So another such question is the question, who feeds on the food of consciousness? So again, that question is regarded as inappropriate because it assumes an agent who does the feeding. And so the idea of to feed or to consume or to partake of the consciousness is assumes that there is somebody who's doing that. And this is a question these days. The usual example of it is, do you beat your wife often? And no, hopefully. So this is a kind of question that is phrased in a way that is leading and which is intended, again, it's a kind of bad faith. It's often a bad faith question that's intended to sort of corral you into a specific kind of answer. Okay, so I'll leave the question of the unanswered questions there for now. I think we've discussed that sufficiently for now, but there's actually quite a lot more on that. And it's the main point that I want to sort of bring across here is I think that it's important for first of all, when reading the suttas, it's important to notice when the Buddha answered questions and when he didn't, and to look into the specifics of the nuance and the context to see why certain questions were answered and certain questions were not answered. And we can often draw out, often draw out specific conclusions dependent on our answers. And I'm just going to give you one example of exactly that. And this is a kind of a well-known argument which was made by Venerable Thanissaro on the well-known American monk, but he's made this argument on many occasions, repeated many times in many different texts and so on. He seems to really like this argument. And he argues that the Buddha never said that there's no such thing as self. And his argument is that when the Buddha was asked that by Vacchagotta, we've met Vacchagotta earlier, the Buddha didn't give him a direct answer. And yet, in another occasion, when he was asked by Mogaraja how to see the world as empty and without self, then he did give an answer. So Thanissaro concludes from this that the problem is that the Buddha didn't want to answer about the existence of a self, but what he wanted to teach was a strategy for not being attached to a self. And if you look at the quotes and examples that Thanissaro gives, it's quite a kind of persuasive argument. And like I said, he seems to really like this argument. The problem is that he only gives a partial quote of the passages. In the passage where he talks about Vacchagotta, Vacchagotta was notorious for coming to the Buddha and badgering him on dozens and dozens and dozens of occasions for questions. I mean, he was testing the Buddha's patience. And look, everybody, if you're a teacher, you love to have a student who inquires, right? It's great, you love it. At the same time, you've got other things to be doing than answering one guy's questions on and on and on. And so at a certain point, the Buddha didn't answer his questions, and but he explained why. He said, I don't say that there is a self, because if I had said that, Vacchagotta would have assumed I was speaking about eternalism. So it was framed in terms of his personal knowledge of Vacchagotta's personality and how he thinks. With Mogaraja, this is a sutta in the Sutta Nipata, according to Thanissaro, the reason that the Buddha answered him and he didn't answer Vacchagotta was because Mogaraja asked about a strategy and not about the existence of the self. The problem with that is that Thanissaro omits the first part of the poem where Mogaraja says, I have already asked you twice and you didn't answer me. And so now for a third time, I ask the same question. I mean, this is not a difficult one in terms of context. Yes, the Buddha did refuse to answer Mogaraja twice, and Mogaraja persisted. Why did the Buddha change his mind? So the real question is not why was there a difference between Vacchagotta and Mogaraja? The real question is why did the Buddha then decide to answer Mogaraja? Well, the text itself doesn't say why the Buddha changed his mind. Presumably either A, this guy is so stubborn, I've got to give him some kind of answer, otherwise he will never shut up, which seems reasonable enough. Or B, but the commentary explanation says that because it was part of a longer discussion, like there's a group of them who are asking and answering questions. And so the commentary says, well, Mogaraja had asked earlier, but he wasn't ready to understand it at that point. But now, because of the additional discussions and questions and answers that have been had, then now his mind is matured and he's ready to answer to understand the answer of the question. Also, quite a reasonable explanation. So, and again, this is a just an illustration of the idea that it illustrates both the point I made about the akara parivitaka earlier, that we have to look to the grounds of reasons, the kinds of ways that people are using their evidence, and we also have to be careful in terms of how we interpret the context, because context is nuanced and subtle. And we have lost most of it. I mean, this is the fact. The fact that we have only this tiny fragments of context that we have from the time of the Buddha, and given that we only have fragments of context left, surely we should be very careful about attending to those little bits that we have. We should treat them as something which is precious. There's a reason why these specific details of context have been passed down, because they tell us something about what's going on. It might not be obvious what they're telling, but they're telling us something. So let's just take a bit of a break here. And now we have a bunch of messages. I'll see about answering a few questions. Okay, so Anne asks about the Buddha's disposition with moral ambiguity. I'll actually talk about that later. That's actually the second part of today's talk, actually. The Buddha did not claim to invent a new teaching. He discovered universal truths, very much so. Gillian says, LOL. Couldn't agree more, Gillian. That's absolutely, absolutely truth. Okay. Praveen says, are there any examples of categorical statements of truth and falsity made by the Buddha? Yes, of course, many times. For example, the Four Noble Truths. This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the ending of suffering, and this is a path leading to the ending of suffering. I've seen in a handful of suttas, such as the Nagara Sutta, okay? The Buddha dissects the chain of dependent origination whereby name and form is conditioned for consciousness, or consciousness is the condition for name and form. Right, from a Vibhajavada perspective, could you please elaborate on what the basis for such a phenomenon accepts no first distinction or analysis? Yeah. Could I? Possibly. Will I? Will I though? Look, Praveen, that's a really interesting question, but it'll probably take us too long to give any kind of satisfactory answer. So I might just leave that one. I'm sorry. Avyakata Dhamma fall under the Tapaniya category? Yes. Generally speaking, yes. That's the point that Jayatileka makes, is that's actually, it was a bit unclear at the beginning, but that point that Jayatileka made right at the beginning of the chapter was that in the suttas, it's not super explicit that the undeclared teachings or the unanswered questions, the Avyakata Dhamma, are the same as the Dhamma, things to be set aside. But all of the different authorities all agree that that is in fact the case. And so that was when Jayatileka was quoting from the Abhidhamma, the commentaries, the Milinda Panha and the Mahasangikas. So they all say that that is in fact the case. The unanswered questions are the same as the questions to be set aside. Of course, it's not limited to that, because the unanswered questions are a specific set of questions. So there can be other things that are also to be set aside. Pacheka Satcha, thanks Korakot for giving the correct spelling for that. Colorless green dreams sleep furiously. Thank you, Michael, for correcting my quote. That's E. Cummings, right? Category mistakes. Because the idea of a category mistake in that particular case, a dream isn't the kind of thing that sleeps, for example. I mean, that whole kind of poetry of that is based on the idea of category mistakes. So it can't be colorless and green. Dreams aren't things that have a color. Dreams don't sleep, and things that sleep don't do so furiously. Typically, anyway. So this is kind of playing on this idea where it's a sentence that grammatically works, right? There's nothing grammatically wrong with it, and yet it somehow just doesn't make any kind of sense. Anyway. Okay, so Michael asks, might atta, or the self, be considered a category mistake by the Buddha because the khandhas are more correct, or these supposed features of atta, like having control of the attas immutably, are not found? I don't know if you'd say the atta is a category mistake in and of itself. I mean, you might ask a question about atta. I think it's a bit more kind of subtle than that. Like the atta, I think, is like a false proposition in the sense that it asserts the reality of a metaphysical entity that isn't there, or for which there's no evidence. Again, whether the khandhas are more correct, I'm not sure that the Buddha would really kind of phrase it that way. You might say that the khandhas are a description of our experience that aligns more closely with how things are, rather than the atta, which is a description of experience that doesn't correspond with anything that we actually experience. This is really the problem that the Buddha had with the atta, that you can talk all you like about it, actual self, but whenever you point to anything, all you can find is form, feeling, perception, intentions, and consciousness. Okay. Further asks, do the asavas exist without awareness? Is the fact that awareness seeks the functional expression of avidya itself? Interesting. Do asavas exist without awareness? Probably not, right? I mean, they're characteristics of sentient beings, so there must be some awareness there, even if it's ignorant awareness. Is the fact that awareness seeks the functional expression of avidya itself. Yeah, I think there's some kind of truth to that. One of the distinguishing features of the psychology of Carl Jung was that he pointed to the desire to know. And former psychologists had looked at, like Freud talked about the desire for pleasure, and Adler talked about the desire for power. And Jung talked about the desire to know. And he pointed out that as human beings, and presumably as other sentient beings as well, we have a curiosity. We want to learn, we want to grow. And it's reductive. Like if we want to look at things through a purely kind of reductive point of view, so everyone's just pleasure seeking, right? Everyone just wants power. And these kinds of analyses they're tempting because they kind of feed into a kind of cynicism about human nature. And these things, pleasure and power are ultimately not as satisfying or not meaningful as goals or as aims for human life. And Jung would, of course, never deny that these are important things, but there's more to human life than that. There is something which is deeper and which we can't just explain it away in a purely kind of cynical way. We want to know, we want to understand. We have a curiosity. If you look at how kids are, kids begin their life with this incredible curiosity, wanting to learn, wanting to understand the world around them. And as they learn, they gradually replace this curiosity with knowledge, views, ideas. And all too often, we lose the curiosity in our older age that we had when we were younger. And this is where we become rigid and doctrinaire. And this is where wisdom curdles and becomes ideology. And so again, one of the things that Jung was pointing to was about how if we don't want to, he said one of the saddest things to see was somebody who in the oldest period of their life still lived according to the same values that they had in the earlier period of their life. And so our growth doesn't stop. Or it shouldn't. We can still keep on learning and still keep on growing. And this is kind of one of those paradoxes. According to Buddhism, the fundamental force that has brought us into this life is this ignorance and is this craving. That's why we've been reborn. And yet, curiously, inexplicably, we want to know. We want to be free. We suspect that there is a deeper and more meaningful truth that is going to free us. And we seek for that. And people are constantly looking for new ways of knowing. We love to consume ways of knowing. We're just not necessarily very good at it. Okay, so Gillian clarified the point that she made earlier. That sentence is how grammatical categories are empty of semantic sense. I thought that in philosophy, the term category mistake meant something different, but I'm never able to grasp the idea. So Gillian, look, you may be correct, and I may be confusing my ideas here. So let's set this one aside and go and read the Wikipedia page on category mistakes afterwards, okay? Okay, questions of Patipucca and Tapaniya. Are there clear distinctions between questions of Patipucca and Tapaniya? Yeah, good point. Like, as with all of these categories, you know, there's going to be fuzzy boundaries, right? Of course. Couldn't the use of the fire candle similarly be a case of counter question? Couldn't the questions based on inappropriate concepts be answered nicely by appropriate counter questions? Yes, in some cases. That's where context is important, and it depends on the person that you're talking to. So in some cases, yes, you can engage with the question and counter question, but if you know that somebody is very rigidly attached to a dogma, if you know that somebody is engaging in a conversation in bad faith, they're not really trying to learn, but they're just trying to trap you. If you know that the questions have the smell of delusion to them, it's sometimes that there's just like a sense that you can have that this is not going to proceed well. It's a very interesting question. I read a interesting analysis just a few days ago, actually, by a sociologist who was talking about from a sociological analysis of how to engage with conspiracy theories and with people who are spreading delusional ideas. And the point that they made was that it was based on a sociological analysis originally published in the 1950s, which has been elaborated since then. But the idea is that you need two things. One is you have to kill them. And this is the first thing that is hard to do. And the thing that was interesting about that is that it's exactly the same answer that the Buddha gave. And the Buddha was asked, what do you do with some of your monastics who you can't get them to understand or to train or to do what you're doing sincerely? And he says, well, in that case, I just have to kill them. And the person says, it seems a bit drastic, doesn't it? And then you have like that whole kind of non-violence thing. How does that kind of fit in there? No. He said, by kill them, it means I don't talk to them. It means I give them the silent treatment. This is the most dramatic thing that the Buddha gave. You know, remember in the just before he died, he gave the silent treatment, you know, to one of the monks who had been badly behaved. And so this is one of the most kind of extreme things that you can do in Buddhism. So the Buddha kills them. You give them the silent treatment. And so this is what this is saying from the sociological perspective, is that this is a kind of social death. That when somebody is no longer able to participate in society in the way that their ego demands that they can, In other words, that someone's identity is that I am a person who has something meaningful to say that you have to take seriously. And if you say to them, no, you don't, I don't take what you're saying seriously, then they experience some kind of social death, which can be merely annoying, or it can be very serious. And in particular, if it's in a professional setting or a family setting or something like that, then it is really kind of challenging if you're put into that situation. So the first thing that they need to experience is that social death. And one of the points that the sociologists made is that for many people, social death is worse than physical death. And this is what we're seeing today constantly with cases of COVID in the United States. People would choose literally to die rather than to admit that they were wrong about COVID. And it happens every day. And it even happens, and people will persist in that even after they die, where people will be saying to the doctors, you can't put on, my husband has died of COVID after telling everybody that COVID wasn't real. You can't put on his death certificate that he died of COVID. And doctors are being told this. They don't do it, right, because it's against the law, but family members are pressuring them to do this. The social death is worse for them. They would rather actually die than to experience this social death. But the social death isn't enough. The next thing that needs to be done is that they need to be cooled. And this is one of the things which the sociologist was arguing is often misunderstood, that people say that we have to empathize with people who have these kinds of extremist kind of views. And sure, empathy is good, but how does empathy actually work? If I, as a Buddhist monk, empathize with somebody, then if it's one of you, then it probably means a lot because you care about what I say. Yeah? But for a lot of people, that's completely meaningless. And actually empathizing doesn't mean anything. Empathy and compassion in a practical way depends on communities, and it depends on who matters to you. And so the practical, it's not to say that we shouldn't empathize, it's just to say that that empathy is not going to actually have a pragmatic effect for that person. Of course, it's good for us, right? It's good to have empathy anyway. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying that it's not going to particularly achieve that objective. So what's needed is somebody who can cool somebody off, and that has to be somebody who's within that community who can, in a way, mentor somebody through that stage and show them that there is a way, there is a path home, and that there is a way to the other side. And so to actually make that happen, there needs to be somebody in the family, needs to be somebody in the neighborhood, in the professional environment, a spiritual mentor, or somebody like that. Needs to be somebody who's respected by that person who can help to bring them back into the fold. So this was a really insightful, I think, sociological analysis of what to happen when these questions are going too far. And you can see that with the Buddha, that he did not succeed in every case. And that also depended on those things. For example, good example is Channa. I mentioned he was given the silent treatment when the Buddha died. And when he heard about that, Ananda went to see him. He said, you got the silent treatment. No one's going to talk to you anymore because you're just too outrageous. That's it, we're done. And he's like, he was in such shock. He was immediately like, what? I can't. And then what happened next? Ananda was there for him. Yeah, Ananda was there for him and took him under his wing and brought him back into the fold. And that was somebody Ananda's support was meaningful for Channa. And at that point, that was what he needed to be brought back in. And so to me, it was fascinating to see that analysis because it corresponded so precisely to what I've seen from the suttas. Okay, very good. So we've now got half an hour left. And I'm going to now skip ahead to the next chapter, not the final chapter. Hopefully everyone's sticking with us. So the next chapter is also really interesting and really important. I'm sorry, we can only do a few bits and pieces of things. Okay. The next chapter is the chapter 7 on logic and truth, and we're going to be mainly looking here at the tetralemma, which Jayati refers to as the 4 logical alternatives. Jayati doesn't like the word tetralemma, which is fine, but it's convenient, so I'm going to be using it. Anyway, so the idea of the tetralemma is a kind of 4-fold set of propositions that characterizes logical discourse in Buddhism and outside of in Indian logic more generally as well, but especially in Buddhism, and is often contrasted with the 2-fold logic found in Western logical theory. So in the West, it's either A or B. That's basically it. And in India, it's both A, or maybe it's B, or maybe it's both A and B, or maybe it's neither A nor B. And this is how the Indians think about it. It's a little bit more wiggle room there. And so this is it's a different kind of approach to truth. And one of the things interesting about Jayati chapter, he begins chapter 2, second paragraph, 561. There seems to be considerable confusion among scholars as to what was meant by this 4-fold schema. Poisson speaks of it as a 4-branch dilemma of Buddhist dialectic and believes that it violates the principle of contradiction. He says, Indians do not make a clear distinction between facts and ideas, between ideas and words. They've never clearly recognized the principle of contradiction. Buddhist dialectic has a 4-branch dilemma. Nirvana is existence or non-existence, or both existence or non-existence, or neither existence nor non-existence. We are helpless. And you can see that this is what I was referring to before. This is a classic example of Diktinijana Kanti, right? So we're looking at this idea, we're trying to consider this idea deeply, but how do we accept this idea when it so fundamentally goes against everything that we've been conditioned? And this whole kind of education on what logic is based on the idea it either is this or it is that, it just doesn't make sense. And either you do what Poisson does and just reject it, they don't understand any of these things, or you allow it, maybe it can transform you. Okay, but this is one of the really powerful approaches to understanding that we find in the suttas. Okay. So as to the idea that Poisson posits that there's no concept of contradiction, Jayati in paragraph 562 says that we find as early as Uddalaka, one of the Upanishadic thinkers, an awareness of the principle of consistency and the problem of contradiction, when it was being held that it could not be both true that being came out of being and non-being. In the Nikayas, consistency is regarded as a criterion of truth and is stated that truth is one and not two. Ekang hi satchang na dutiyam atti, from the Sutta Nipata. The dilemmas present 2 alternatives, one of which is a contradiction of another. In fact, in one place in the Samyutta Nikaya, we come very close to a formal statement of the principle of non-contradiction. Again, I won't go quite into that because that goes on a little bit too long. Where are we now? 560, 562, okay, 574. All right, we're going to skip ahead to the paragraph number 574. Now, if we refer to the 4 forms of predication by the Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, and 4 respectively, what we intended to show that it means each of the 4 options of the tetralemma. What we intended to show in our article was that 3 and 4, despite their form, were contingent propositions purporting to give us information about some alleged state of affairs. this is a brilliant insight by Jayatileka. So when we're talking about these four propositions, it's not just that we're using an analytical category that divides up the truth in some kind of way, but we're actually trying to describe how reality is in ways that can't be captured by black and white statements, is and is not. Let's take an example where we're quite certain about the meaning of the third and fourth category. And again, nice example here by Jayatileka of the proper way to take argumentation is that you begin with something that you know. You begin with something that's relatively knowable, and then you move to things that are relatively less knowable. So in this case, what is more knowable is this particular set of questions. It's very comprehensible. Is the world infinite or not? This is the question. If we ask a question, for example, does the Tathagata exist after death? Then that's relatively less knowable. It's mysterious. What happens after death is mysterious. Who the Tathagata is mysterious. Or the nature of rebirth is mysterious. And so this is a mysterious question. Whether the universe is infinite or not is a much better and more easily definable question. It doesn't mean it's easy to answer. It just means it's easy to understand the question. So the four options. This world is finite. Fair enough. The world is infinite. Also fair enough. This world is both finite and infinite. This world is neither finite nor infinite. Okay, so this is an example of the tetralemma. Four different options that are being presented. The world is finite. Okay, it's got limits. It's infinite, no limits. It's both finite and infinite. How does that work? It's neither finite nor infinite. That's kind of weird. And so you start with saying something that seems relatively straightforward. It's an either true or false proposition. And then you go into these kind of weird kind of states. Now, one of the things that arguments that Jayatileka's making is he makes an argument that the first pair are contrary rather than contradictory. And the distinction is that in contradictory pairs, if the truth of one must imply the falsity of the other. And if that's the case, then the third and fourth options don't really make sense. On the other hand, a contrary position doesn't necessarily imply the falsity of the other. They can both, in that case, the third and fourth propositions can be quite meaningful. So there are very simple ways of understanding this particular proposition. And generally speaking, simple is good. So if we can understand these things in a very simple, basic, and concrete way, then we've made some progress. The universe is infinite. Great. Right? Universe is bounded. That's great. What does it mean to say the universe is both infinite and bounded? Well, an obvious solution to that would be to say that the universe is flat. Right? The universe is flat. It's infinite horizontally, but it's bounded vertically. All right? Yeah. Actually, there's nothing mysterious about it at all. Actually, it's just a state of affairs. It's one possible proposition for how the universe is constructed. The universe is infinite in one direction and bounded in another direction. Yeah? So this is a really good insight that Jayatileka is making, and this applies in other cases where the tetralemma applies as well. For example, another example that he gives later is pleasure and pain. Right. So when you're reborn, you go to your next life. Do you experience pleasure or pain? Well, you go to your next life. Ekanta sukhi. Only experience happiness. That would be nice. Now we go to the next life. Only experience pain. No, we don't want that one. Go to the next life. We experience both pleasure and pain. A mixture of pleasure and pain. You can see that these things they're not contradicting each other, right? They're not. There's nothing logically difficult about assuming that you can be reborn in a world that experiences both pleasure and pain. I mean, here we are, right? Check it out. So both pleasure and pain, or you can be reborn in a world where there's neither pleasure nor pain. Okay, for example, in a state where there's no consciousness. So imagine that you were reborn as Sleeping Beauty, for example, and you're just asleep for 100 years. You're not really experiencing anything. You're just lying there. And so there are certain realms in Buddhism that are said to be like that, where you just experience a neutral feeling or even don't have any experiences at all. And so again, when you see this tetralemma, it's not intended to present you with paradoxes. It's not trying to be clever. It's trying to describe states of the world that don't always fit neatly into the category of either one thing or the other. All right, so another really good example of this and is in the question of karma. And again, I'm saying this, recalling that we're on the anniversary of 9/11 and the finishing of the war after 20 years in Afghanistan. And when people go to war, the question that they ask themselves is this justified or not? And in Western philosophical theory, you have this notion of the just war. And I wrote an article about this many years ago, arguing that there's no concept of a just war in Buddhism, and for good reason, because the concept of a just war is there to justify war. That's why it exists. It's there to provide you as a set of reasons so philosophers can sit in their comfortable offices and write arguments that are satisfying to their intellect about why it can be possible to go to war sometimes. And those papers can then be taken by politicians in their nice, comfortable offices, and they can fit them into this particular war that they want to go on. And that's how the theory of just war works. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are a good example of this, where you did have obviously a terrible provocation with the attacks on 9/11. And so many people were arguing that these wars were justified. But if you look at the theory of just war, one of the fundamental tenets of any just war theory is that it be proportional. And how we assess proportionality is, of course, not always easy. But when the provocation involved 3,000 deaths and the response to it involved more than 1 million deaths, then clearly this is not even close to being proportional. So the theory of just war is conveniently disposed of when we want to. And so in Buddhism, there's never been developed a theory of just war. And I think that's a good thing. At the same time, though, it's difficult to condemn all kinds of war because, well, sometimes your country is invaded. Sometimes they're going to kill you and kill your neighbors. Sometimes they're going to go around and rape all the women. Sometimes they're going to go and burn all the cities. What are you going to do? Are you going to just sit there and just let them do all those things? So what would the Buddha do? Well, the Buddha would probably, yes. I mean, he wouldn't go out there. And so, but can you criticize somebody? I mean, if somebody fights to defend their town or defend their neighborhood against someone's killing, I mean, is this wrong? How can you say that that person's wrong? And so in a conventional kind of morality of either black or white, then it's really hard to account for these kinds of cases. This is why you end up by saying it's a just war. But the way that the fact that Buddhism doesn't have a just war theory doesn't mean that we can't account for those cases, but it means that we have a more subtle way of accounting for them. The Buddha said that there are deeds that are black, deeds that are bright, deeds that are both black and bright, and deeds that are neither black nor bright. That leads to the ending of deeds. And sometimes things are good. Yeah? If you can protect your country and save people's lives without causing any harm, great. That's perfect. That's the best option. That's the white karma. If you aggressively invade and attack another person's country and kill people without any good reason, then this is bad. And this is black karma. Absolutely. But what happens if you have to kill in self-defense? Well, killing is bad, but defending the innocent is good. This is both black and white. We can't say, is this justified or is this not justified? Because it doesn't fit into a binary set of morality. It's both, there are good aspects to it and there are bad aspects to it. Do the good aspects outweigh the bad aspects? Who can say? Sometimes, probably, maybe, sometimes, probably, maybe not. It's difficult to say. And there's a beautiful reflection on this, and a couple of lines in the Mahavamsa, which my favorite lines in the Mahavamsa, which probably my favorite lines, reflection on the nature of political life ever, where it says at the end of one of the great kings of Sri Lanka, and I think it was Mahasena, if I remember correctly, and it said, it sums up his life by saying, and having done many good things and many bad things, he passed on to fare according to his karma. Yeah, that's how it is. Yeah, that's how these worldly decisions are. And so let's not fall into that kind of rhetoric of saying, you know, this is what we should be doing, or this is justified, this is not justified. War is always terrible, and the alternatives are almost always better. If people have to go to war to defend their country, their lives, their neighbors, then do it with the minimum of harm that you possibly can. And, you know, the question of is this something that's ultimately justifiable or not, that's something that karma has to deal with. It's not something that we can sort of work out for ourselves. So all we can do is try to, with every choice that we make, to reduce the harm that we cause and to try to increase the good that we cause. And the Buddha's choice in that case would have been the neither black nor white karma, because the Buddha's teaching is a karma that doesn't lead to being reborn. If you do good deeds, you'll be reborn in a good place. If you do bad deeds, you'll be reborn in a bad place. If you do deeds that are both good and bad, you'll be reborn in a place where you experience both good and bad things. But if you step back from all of those things and practice the Noble Eightfold Path, then that can lead to the ending of karma, which leads to the ending of rebirth and the ending of suffering. All right, so this is a few words and a few reflections on the tetralemma and on the meaning of the tetralemma. Now, there are many different examples of the tetralemma, and not all of them are easy to understand in that way. Like, there are different cases. And so Jayatilleka began with some of the easier cases, like the world is infinite or not, or the whether you experience pleasure and pain and so on. These are relatively simple concepts. But it's also applied in other cases where the meaning is not quite so clear. So this isn't necessarily to solve all of these cases, but it is to say that when we're looking at the tetralemma, we're not looking at something which is just trying to be clever. We're not looking at something which is just a paradox for the sake of it. And we're not looking at something which is contradicting basic laws or basic principles of logic. What tetralemma attempts to do is to describe the reality of the world by accounting for and giving weight to certain cases and certain possibilities that can't readily be reduced to simple black and white alternatives. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting and most powerful aspects of Buddhist logic, because it really kind of, if we understand it and apply it carefully, it provides a kind of middle way between, on the one hand, the purely black and white thinking, this is right or this is wrong, where you're going to end up just butting heads with people all the time. Again, that case of the just war is a typical case. Is war just? Is this war just or is it not? we can butt heads about that all the time, and it doesn't actually help us to learn anything. But if we ask a question like, what kinds of harm come from this war, and what kinds of good come from this war, then you can understand the people and the actual things that are going on in that case, without feeling the need to impose an idea that it's got to be one thing or the other. So this idea of the fourfold tetralemma is very powerful in that way. It's also very powerful because it not only avoids the extreme of being overly dogmatic, it also avoids the other extreme of being overly subjectivist and overly nihilistic with one's epistemology. And I talked a little bit earlier about that idea of the pure pacceka sacca, pure subjectivist approach to truth, and how ultimately this ends up with a kind of nihilism where you can't communicate, you can't inquire, you can't improve your views because anyone's view is as valid as anybody else's. So that, and often you find that when people come to that kind of idea, especially in religious and moral and philosophical areas, they come to that kind of idea because they want to avoid the kind of argy-bargy and conflict that comes from overly dogmatic views. So you say, look, people who just have these different views, they're just arguing with each other all the time. I'm going to be better than that. I'm going to accept everybody's view as being valid for them. That's the pacceka sacca. This view is valid for you. And look, if you are having a conversation at a dinner table with your family on Christmas Day, that's probably a good idea, okay? Great, do that. And get through Christmas dinner nicely. That would be excellent. Huh? But if you actually want to learn and find something true about the world, then you need to be able to dig down and find the truth. So the tetralemmas give us an approach which is going to be more flexible than the binary approach, but at the same time, not just sort of completely subjectivist. It still gives us some framework of understanding and assessing the truth. All right. So 4, 6. Okay, I'm now going to skip ahead once more to a couple of more points that I want to discuss briefly. For paragraph 593, the conception of truth as we find it in the Nikayas. There is no direct inquiry into the nature of truth in the epistemological sense, but the value placed on truth in the wider sense was so great that some observations about the nature of truth were perhaps inevitable. In the Abhaya Raja Kumara Sutta, we find statements classified according to their truth value, their utility, and their pleasantness. Right? Very useful, right? Very useful. Is something true? Is it useful? Is it pleasing? 3 different things. All important, right? All important, but quite distinct. And so things can have different combinations of these things. It might be both true and useless, it might be, and so on and so forth. But there are, anyway, I won't go into that kind of too much, but just to say that this idea of the, and this idea of the truth value, the meaning, and the pleasantness of statements is also found in the basic definition of right speech. Right, so we're used to in the precepts, musavada veramani, refraining from false speech. But in the more elaborate description of right speech, it also includes speech which is meaningful. Yeah, atta sanhita, yeah, speech which is meaningful, speech which is also speech which is pleasing to the ear. Yeah, these are also qualities of speech which are really important as well. Speech has an emotional component to it, and it has a component of meaning. These are aspects of right speech. Okay, and I want to get to some of your questions. So I am just going to continue briefly to make one more point in one more paragraph. And that is, where are we now? 602, paragraph 602. If truth is what corresponds with fact and is consistent within itself, what was the relation of truth to utility? Mrs. Rhys-Davids, arguing against the theory that the Buddha was a rationalist, suggests that he be called a utilitarian, in the sense of being a pragmatist for whom truth is what works. She says utilitarian might be urged with some weight. Rationalist, surely not. In the very sutta chosen to illustrate the latter assertion, the rational grounds for testing a gospel are only to be cited to be put aside. The one test to be used is, what effect will this teaching produce on my life? Poisson too calls early Buddhism pragmatic. This pragmatism of Buddhism is also strongly suggested by the parable of the arrow and the parable of the raft. The parable of the arrow occurs in reference to the unexplained, unanswered questions. And the gist of it is that a man struck with a poisoned arrow should be concerned with removing the arrow and getting well, rather than be interested in purely theoretical questions about the nature of the arrow, who shot it, etc. The moral is that the man would only be interested in truths which have a practical bearing on his life. In the same context, it was said that the unanswered questions were not answered because it was not useful, not related to the fundamentals, not conducive to revulsion, dispassion, cessation, peace, higher knowledge, realization, and nirvana. The parable of the raft has the same motive and is intended to indicate the utilitarian character of the teachings or the truth of Buddhism. The truths are useful for salvation, but even they should not be clung to, however useful they may have been. It is said, I preach to you a Dhamma comparable to a raft for the sake of crossing over and not for the sake of clinging to it. A person intending to cross a river and get to the other bank where it is safe and secure makes a raft, and with its help safely reaches the other bank. But however useful the raft may have been, he would throw it aside and go his way without carrying it on his shoulders. So it's said that those who realize Dhamma to be like a raft should discard the Dhamma as well and not speak of what is not Dhamma. So this is a strong emphasis on the pragmatic value of the Dhamma. Now, clearly this is true, right? Clearly it's true that Dhamma is pragmatic and that this is where its primary value comes from. However, Jayatilleka goes on, we should not interpret this to mean that the Dhamma is true only by virtue of its utility and it ceases to be true when it ceases to be useful. That is a very important point. When the simile of the raft says that we leave the Dhamma behind, it doesn't mean that the Dhamma stops being true, right? It just means that, well, we've got where we wanted to go, but all the things that have been taught in the Dhamma are still true. So if we explain the utility value, if we explain the truth of Buddhism being solely in terms of utility, then it would stop being true once we've got to the other side. And this is not a theoretical argument at all. This is a very normal and common thing that you find in spiritual circles. Sorry about that. Network dropped out at this end, so unfortunately I had to switch over to my phone. I'm not sure when I finished. I saw you guys were getting a little bit still. I thought you were just getting bored. And then I don't know. Okay, anyway, just briefly wrap up what I was saying before, that the idea that when we've crossed over that we can let go of the truth is a very practical one, because that's essentially what so many cult leaders say. The rules don't apply to me because I've already come over the path. So that's not what it means. It's the truth. The Dhamma is true and useful. The reason the Buddha focuses on certain questions and not on others is because there are certain kinds of truth that are not useful, at least for the purposes of liberation. So it's not that all truth has equal value, but the teachings of the Dhamma are both true and useful. And of course, they are useful also because they're true, because they align with the way that the world is. Then it's not just randomly that they happen to be true, but they are true insofar as they agree with reality. Again, that approach to truth is very much in line with scientific truth, where truth in science is regarded as being something that is contingent and pragmatic and statistical. It's true within a certain degree of probability, depending on the accuracy of the measurements. And whether a scientific proposition is true or not is ultimately determined by whether it works. And if I think that I understand aerodynamics, then I can calculate aerodynamics and I can say these laws of aerodynamics are true. But at the end of the day, the plane either stays in the air or it falls out of the sky. and that's all that actually matters. So in Buddhism, the same thing is true. So we can argue about the truth of Buddhism, but the thing that matters at the end of the day is, does it help us to overcome suffering? And that's what really matters. Okay. Got a few more questions. And a few more questions here in the chat, which I'll just briefly have a look at before we go on. Okay, so Praveen asks another interesting question. Could a possible resolution to the tetralemma be the different definitions of world in the suttas, i.e. as to whether it references the 6 sense fields or the world in general? I'm not exactly sure in that particular case. I think that that's more of a cosmological question. But yes, this is another aspect of that take on truth, isn't it, right? Because words can have different meanings in different contexts. But hopefully that one, I think that would be addressed through the counter questioning approach, right? So if there's a case where words can have dual meanings, then you'd probably want to clarify the meaning, clarify the exact sense of it before getting too much into the answer. Panadeepa says, flat is a technical term in cosmology. It indicates a 3D spatially infinite universe. There's some solution of universe models where it's infinite in one direction, finite in one direction, infinite in another, where the finite direction means that if you go in that direction, you can come back from the opposite direction. Interesting, right? So yeah, so I mean, and it is interesting how in cosmology that these questions are still unanswered, right? I mean, the Buddha said, no, I'm not going to try to answer that, and here we still go. Okay, so Deepika's had to leave a little bit early, and Dhamma is Dhamma. Dhamma goes beyond the scope of Buddhism. Okay, very good. Oh, I think we've reached everything. Oh, that was good. Well, oops, no, one more question. Oh, yeah, so just to mention on October 2nd, together with Nadine, who I believe is on this talk somewhere. I didn't see her, but I saw a Nadine anyway. I'm not sure if it's the same one. We're going to be giving a talk with the through the Nantians community of practices, and this is organized together with Ling and Tom. And check out 2030. I'm not sure what that means. Check out 2030 from John Register. There's Nadine. Yeah, so she's there. Hey, how's it going, Nadine? So anyway, Nadine, you've got an advantage because you know the kinds of things that I'm going to be wanting to talk about there. So that's good. Anyway, so Tom and Ling, do you have a link? Either Tom or Ling, do you have a link for that talk? You might just pop that on the chat for anybody who's interested. All right. So we are probably going to want to wrap up there. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you for, this is a topic which I've always loved, and it's been really interesting for me in my own Dhamma practice, but sometimes I feel that I'm weird and nobody else really is interested. So I'm glad to know that there are other weirdos in the world. So this is nice. Thank you.